Remember those frugal meals your southern mama made that somehow felt indulgent, even in the leanest years? Back then, a single ham bone or a bag of beans could stretch across days, filling the table with comfort and care. They weren't just cheap suppers. They were lessons in survival wrapped in love. So why have so many of these hard times favorites disappeared from our kitchens today? Red beans and rice. In the South, nothing stretched a dollar further than a pot of beans, and red beans were the star. Grandma would set them to simmer in the morning with onions, peppers, and maybe a scrap of ham bone if one was lying around. The smell would drift through the farmhouse all afternoon, making even the leanest day feel like Sunday supper. Rice was the magic trick. Cheap, filling, and always waiting in the pantry. A scoop of rice under those beans doubled the meal and made it stick to your ribs. Kids would line up with bowls, eager to ladle out their share, and no one ever left the table hungry. It wasn't steak or roast beef, but when you topped it with hot sauce and had cornbread on the side, you couldn't convince anyone it wasn't indulgent. That's the secret. Beans and rice weren't just survival food. They were comfort disguised as thrift. Biscuits and gravy. Now, biscuits and gravy were proof that Grandma could turn nothing into something worth remembering. Flour, baking powder, a splash of milk, and a little lard became golden biscuits baked right in her cast-iron skillet. While they puffed up, she'd make gravy out of meat drippings, sausage if the budget allowed, bacon grease if it didn't. She whisked in flour until it browned just right, then poured in milk, stirring until it thickened into creamy heaven. Those biscuits would split open with a cloud of steam, and Grandma would spoon that peppery gravy over them until the plate was almost too heavy to carry. It was frugal to the bone, made from scraps most folks might toss out. But in that kitchen, it felt like you were being spoiled. For families facing hard times, biscuits and gravy weren't just breakfast. They were a hug on a plate. Chicken and dumplings. If you've never stretched one chicken into 3 meals, you didn't grow up with a southern mama. First came Sunday dinner, roasted or fried if times were kind. The next day, what was left of that bird went into a pot, simmering until the last bit of meat fell off the bone. In went flour dumplings. Some rolled thin, others dropped in by the spoonful, puffing up and soaking in the broth like little pillows. The smell filled the kitchen with warmth, and the steam fogged up the windows. Even when the cupboard was bare, chicken and dumplings made it feel like you had more than enough. Kids scraped their bowls clean, hoping for seconds, and Mama would just smile, knowing she'd turned one scrawny chicken into a whole feast. In hard times, chicken and dumplings were proof that thrift could taste downright indulgent. Meatloaf with oats. Hamburger wasn't cheap, and a single pound wouldn't stretch far unless Mama knew her tricks. She'd fold in oats or breadcrumbs, bulking up the mixture until it filled a pan. With onion, ketchup, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire, it smelled so good baking that nobody cared how much meat was actually in it. When that glaze of ketchup caramelized on top, the kids came running to the kitchen like it was Christmas. Thick slices were served with mashed potatoes, or sometimes just bread and butter. Even reheated the next day, it made sandwiches that felt like a luxury. Meatloaf might have been born out of thrift, but with oats working quietly in the background, it became a dish people craved. It wasn't just survival food. It was Mama's way of proving she could make a single pound of beef feed a crowd like royalty. Potato soup with onions. On the coldest nights when the pantry seemed bare, Mama could turn potatoes into comfort in a pot. She'd peel and chop them, sometimes leaving the skins on to make them go further, and drop them into simmering water with onions and maybe a splash of milk. A dollop of bacon grease or butter, if she had it, gave the broth a depth that felt richer than it really was. Ladled into bowls with crackers or a heel of bread, it warmed you clear through to your toes. The beauty of potato soup was its simplicity, cheap, filling, and able to stretch across days. But more than that, it turned, we have nothing, into, we have enough. It may have been a poor man's dish, But when Mama served potato soup, you felt cared for, warmed and indulged, even in the middle of lean times. Fried cabbage with cornbread. Cabbage was the workhorse of hard times cooking, cheap, hearty, and versatile. Mama would chop it up and fry it in a cast-iron skillet with bacon drippings, onions, and a sprinkle of salt and pepper. The sizzle filled the room, and the smell was enough to make neighbors wander over to check in, pair it with hot cornbread straight from the oven, and you had a meal that was both filling and satisfying. Kids might have rolled their eyes at vegetables, but fried cabbage tasted almost sweet, and no one left the table hungry. The best part? A head of cabbage could stretch across several meals, feeding a family when meat was scarce. It wasn't glamorous, but paired with cornbread and a tall glass of sweet tea, fried cabbage was proof that even a humble vegetable could feel indulgent. Pinto beans and ham hock. If you were blessed enough to have a ham bone or hock lying around, you could flavor an entire pot of beans. Pinto beans soaked overnight and simmered all day became creamy and rich, with that smoky flavor weaving through every bite. Cornbread was the natural partner, crumbled into the bowl or eaten on the side to mop up the juices. It was a dish that lasted for days, reheating better each time, until it seemed like the beans had taken on a life of their own. In tough times, a single pot like that was survival, but it never felt like just scraping by. It felt abundant, like there was always more where that came from. Pinto beans and ham hock showed how one small scrap of meat could turn a pot of beans into something indulgent enough to be remembered decades later. Macaroni and tomatoes. In hard times, pasta and canned tomatoes were a Southern mama's safety net. She'd boil elbow macaroni until it was tender, then stir it into a skillet of stewed tomatoes with onions, butter, and a sprinkle of black pepper. It was tangy, simple, and surprisingly filling, especially when paired with a slice of white bread or cornbread. Kids might wrinkle their noses at first, but after one bite, they'd eat until the pot was empty. For families with little to spend, this dish felt indulgent because it was hot, hearty, and always ready in under half an hour. It became one of those recipes passed down because it reminded folks that survival could still taste like comfort. Macaroni and tomatoes might not sound glamorous, but on a cold evening when money was tight, it was a dish that made you thankful for a full bowl. Cornmeal mush, fried next day. Cornmeal mush was the 2-for-1 bargain of the Depression kitchen. At night, Mama would cook it up like porridge, stirring until the mixture thickened enough to eat warm with a pat of butter or a drizzle of syrup. The leftovers were poured into a pan, chilled overnight, then sliced and fried the next morning until golden and crisp. Served with eggs, or topped with a spoonful of gravy, it became an entirely new meal. Families loved the way it stretched a single bag of cornmeal into days of eating, and kids especially loved the crispy edges of fried slices. It was proof that even repetition could feel special when presented in a new form. Cornmeal mush didn't just fill stomachs, it showed ingenuity, turning humble cornmeal into an indulgence that stuck in people's memories long after the lean years were gone. Shepherd's pie with leftovers. Shepherd's pie in the South wasn't fancy lamb or beef, it was a casserole born out of leftovers. Mama would gather whatever vegetables were lingering, green beans, carrots, peas, and mix them with scraps of meat, sometimes barely more than a few spoonfuls. The whole thing was topped with mashed potatoes, smoothed over, and sometimes dotted with butter before going into the oven. When it came out bubbling and browned, it looked and smelled like a feast. No one asked what was in it. The beauty of shepherd's pie was that it transformed odds and ends into something whole. It taught children not to waste, and it taught families that thrift could taste indulgent if it was wrapped in mashed potatoes. Even today, when we see shepherd's pie, it carries the memory of how Grandma turned scraps into something hearty and soul-satisfying. Salmon patties. A single can of salmon could stretch to feed a whole family when Mama knew her way around the kitchen. She'd flake it into a bowl with egg, onion, and crushed crackers or cornmeal, then shape it into patties and fry them golden in a skillet. Served with a squeeze of lemon or a dollop of mayonnaise, they felt like fine dining compared to the usual beans and bread. The crispy crust and tender inside made them a favorite with children and grown-ups alike. Best of all, 1 can of salmon, cheap and shelf-stable, turned into enough patties for seconds and leftovers. The smell alone would bring the family to the table, eager to eat. Salmon patties may have been frugal, but on the plate, they felt indulgent, like a little bit of luxury snuck into the middle of hard times. Stuffed bell peppers. When bell peppers were cheap at the market or coming in from the garden, Mama knew how to turn them into supper. She'd hollow them out and fill them with a mix of rice, onion, tomato, and maybe just a pinch of ground beef to stretch the flavor. Baked until tender, the peppers held together like little edible bowls, each one steaming with savory filling. They looked festive on the table, like a special occasion meal, even though they cost pennies to make. Families loved the way each person got their own pepper. It felt personal, almost fancy. And because the peppers carried so much flavor, no one missed the fact that meat was scarce. Stuffed bell peppers were a lesson in thrift dressed up as indulgence, proving that even in the hardest times, Mama could make a simple vegetable feel like a prize. Turnip greens with cornbread. In the South, greens were more than a side dish. They were a way of life. When money was scarce, Mama would head out to the garden or the farmer's market for a big bundle of turnip greens. They'd simmer all day in a pot with water, onions, and a scrap of fatback or ham bone if she had it. The smell filled the house, earthy and savory, and the broth, known as pot liquor, was so good folks would drink it straight from their bowls. A hot skillet of cornbread always sat nearby, ready to crumble into the greens or soak up every last drop. It was humble food, but it carried memories of tradition, thrift, and the simple joy of eating what came from the land. In hard times, turnip greens with cornbread reminded families that they could eat like kings with little more than a garden harvest. Fried green tomatoes. Before they were immortalized in a movie title, fried green tomatoes were just a clever way not to waste unripened fruit. Mama would slice those firm, tart tomatoes, dip them in cornmeal, and fry them up until golden brown and crispy. Served hot with a sprinkle of salt, they made a plateful of what felt like southern caviar. Children might have groaned at vegetables, but nobody turned down fried green tomatoes. They were often a summertime supper on their own, paired with bread and beans when money was tight. The crunch of that cornmeal coating and the tangy bite inside made them unforgettable. It was another reminder that waste had no place in a southern kitchen. Every green tomato could become a treat if cooked with a little imagination. Frugal, yes, but so indulgent in flavor that fried green tomatoes became a comfort food classic. Grits and gravy. Every Southerner knew the power of grits, but in lean times, grits became the backbone of whole meals. Cheap, filling, and quick to cook, they were often served morning and night. What made them indulgent was the gravy, made from sausage if the budget allowed, but more often from simple drippings and flour whisked into a creamy sauce. Pour that over a steaming bowl of grits, and suddenly a few pennies worth of cornmeal became stick-to-your-ribs comfort. Some folks even topped it with a fried egg to stretch the protein. It was proof that it wasn't the ingredients, but the love and resourcefulness behind them that made food memorable. For families scraping by, grits and gravy were both survival and indulgence, transforming the ordinary into a dish people still crave decades later. Rice pudding for supper. Rice pudding was the sweet trick up Mama's sleeve when the cupboards looked bare. Leftover rice was simmered with milk, sugar, and a dash of cinnamon, sometimes with raisins if you were lucky. The mixture thickened into a creamy, comforting bowl that felt more like dessert than dinner. But when times were lean, dessert sometimes was dinner. Kids loved it because it felt like a treat, and parents loved it because it filled hungry bellies without breaking the budget. The aroma of cinnamon and vanilla turned the house into something special, even when money was thin. Rice pudding was indulgence disguised as thrift, proving that a spoonful of sweetness could make hard times a little easier to bear. Egg and potato hash. When paychecks were late or gardens were thin, eggs and potatoes saved the day. Mama would chop potatoes into cubes, fry them up with onions, and then crack in a few eggs, stirring it all into a golden, sizzling hash. The result was hearty, filling, and big enough to feed the whole family. Leftovers could be reheated in the morning, making it stretch even further. Kids loved the crispy edges of the potatoes and the rich flavor of the eggs mixed in. It was a one-skillet wonder. Cheap to make, easy to cook, and satisfying in a way only comfort food can be. In the South, this dish was proof that sometimes the most frugal meals were also the most beloved. Egg and potato hash turned the simplest ingredients into a supper that tasted far more indulgent than it cost. Cabbage rolls with rice. When Mama had a head of cabbage and a little imagination, she could stretch a pound of rice into something that felt like a grand occasion. She'd carefully peel the leaves, boil them until pliable, and then roll them around a filling of rice, onion, and just a pinch of ground beef or sausage if she had it. Nestled in a baking dish with a thin tomato sauce, they baked until tender and savory. Each roll looked like a little package, and the children thought they were fancy enough for company. It was a clever way to take humble ingredients and turn them into something beautiful and satisfying. Cabbage rolls made sure no one noticed the absence of meat, because the flavor carried through every bite. They were a Depression-era trick that lingered in Southern kitchens, reminding families that frugality could still carry a touch of indulgence. Chicken and rice casserole. One chicken breast might not look like much, but Mama had her ways. She'd shred it into cooked rice, mix in cream of mushroom soup, and top the dish with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers for a little crunch. After baking, it came out bubbling hot and aromatic, feeding a whole family with what started as a single cut of meat. The casserole was filling, comforting, and felt far richer than its humble beginnings. Leftovers reheated beautifully, making it stretch across days. It wasn't just thrift. It was efficiency wrapped up in comfort food. Even today, chicken and rice casserole carries the memory of how one small piece of meat could be stretched with love and ingenuity into something indulgent enough to satisfy a crowd. Beans and hoe cakes. How cakes were the cornbread's country cousin, fried right on a skillet until golden brown and crisp around the edges. Paired with a pot of Pinto or navy beans, they turned into a full-fledged supper. Mama would ladle the beans into bowls, then hand out hoe cakes to sop up the rich broth. They were cheap, simple, and filling, but the crispy cakes made the meal feel special, like a treat. Families ate until the pot was scraped clean, and sometimes even fought over the last hoe cake. In the South, beans and hoe cakes became a symbol of resilience, a meal that filled stomachs and lifted spirits without costing more than a few cents. It was humble fare, but in hard times, it felt indulgent enough to call everyone to the table with smiles. Sweet potato biscuits. Sweet potatoes weren't just for pies. In hard times, Mama mashed them into biscuit dough, creating soft, golden rolls with a subtle sweetness. The potatoes made the biscuits moist and hearty, stretching flour and adding nutrition when food was scarce. Served hot with butter or drizzled with a little molasses, they became the star of the table. Sweet potato biscuits paired beautifully with beans, soups, or just a glass of milk, and their flavor lingered long after the last bite. They were cheap, practical, and delicious, showing how Southern kitchens turned necessity into invention. For children who grew up with them, those biscuits weren't just food. They were memories of comfort, resilience, and a mama who always knew how to make do. Sweet potato biscuits proved that even thrift could rise warm and indulgent from the oven. Ham bone soup. A ham bone was never thrown away in Mama's kitchen. It was the start of a whole new meal. She'd drop it into a pot with water, onions, carrots, and potatoes, letting it simmer until the broth turned smoky and rich. The bone gave flavor to everything it touched, and soon the kitchen smelled like a feast. Even if there was no meat left clinging to it, the essence of ham transformed plain vegetables into something hearty and comforting. Served with bread or biscuits, ham bone soup could stretch for days, feeding the family again and again. It was the epitome of Southern thrift, taking what others might discard and turning it into the centerpiece of supper. For families in hard times, ham bone soup was indulgence distilled from scraps, a reminder that nothing in Mama's kitchen went to waste. Fried bolognia sandwiches. When money was tight, fancy deli meats were out of the question, but a pack of bolognia could stretch across the week. Mama would toss thick slices into a hot skillet, letting the edges curl and blister until they were browned and savory. She'd tuck the fried slices into soft white bread, sometimes with mustard or a slice of onion, and call it supper. Kids loved the sizzle and smell, and it felt like a treat compared to the usual beans and bread. If there was cheese handy, a melted slice made it indulgent enough to rival a diner meal. Fried bologna sandwiches might not have looked elegant, but they were pure comfort, salty, crispy, and satisfying. For Southern families in hard times, they proved that even the humblest ingredients could be turned into a meal worth remembering. Okra and tomatoes. Okra and tomatoes were a Southern pairing that didn't cost much, but packed a punch of flavor. Mama would slice fresh or frozen okra, stew it with canned or garden tomatoes, and add onions and a little seasoning. The result was a skillet dish that could be spooned over rice or eaten with cornbread on the side. It was tangy, savory, and comforting, with the okra thickening the dish naturally. Families loved it because it was hearty enough to be supper on its own, yet frugal enough to stretch for days. In lean years, okra and tomatoes were proof that you didn't need meat on the table to feel full. The dish was humble, yes, but when served hot and steaming, it tasted indulgent, like summer captured in a pot, even in the middle of hard times. Vegetable soup from scraps. No Southern kitchen ever let leftovers go to waste. Mama would gather up every stray carrot peel, potato scrap, and celery end, simmering them into a big pot of vegetable soup. A few beans, a handful of rice or pasta, and maybe a little broth cube turned scraps into something hearty and filling. Each pot was different depending on what was on hand, but it always came out comforting and nourishing. Served with crackers or bread, it fed the whole family, often with enough for the next day. Kids called it everything soup, and it carried the lesson that thrift could still taste good. In hard times, vegetable soup wasn't just about survival. It was about making something from nothing and enjoying every warm, indulgent spoonful. Cornbread and buttermilk supper. It doesn't get simpler than cornbread crumbled into a tall glass of buttermilk, but for many Southern families, it was a full meal. Mama would bake a skillet of cornbread, then pour cold buttermilk over a slice, softening it into something like a savory pudding. It was tangy, hearty, and surprisingly refreshing after a long day in the fields or the mill. Children learned early that this was more than a snack. It was supper, filling and satisfying. It carried families through lean nights when there was little else in the cupboard. Cornbread and buttermilk was born of thrift, but it felt indulgent in its own way, carrying the taste of tradition and survival in every bite. Peanut butter sandwich suppers. Peanut butter may seem ordinary now, but during hard times, it was a reliable source of protein that didn't spoil quickly. Mama would spread it thick between slices of bread, sometimes adding bananas, honey, or jelly when she could. Paired with a glass of milk, it became a filling supper that children actually looked forward to. On the leanest nights, peanut butter sandwiches were a lifesaver, keeping hunger at bay while stretching the grocery budget further. They were portable, quick, and comforting, reminding families that simple didn't mean unsatisfying. Peanut butter suppers proved that indulgence could come from the humblest jar in the pantry, especially when Mama added that little touch of sweetness to make it special. Fried potatoes and onions. Few meals were simpler, yet none disappeared from the table faster. Mama would slice up potatoes and onions, then fry them in a big cast-iron skillet until the potatoes turned golden brown and the onions caramelized just enough to sweeten the whole dish. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was all it needed. Some nights, she'd crack in an egg or two to stretch it even further, turning it into a skillet supper that tasted richer than it had any right to. The crispy edges and soft centers made every bite satisfying, and children often argued over who got the last spoonful. Fried potatoes and onions were proof that you didn't need meat or fancy ingredients, just a hot skillet and a little love. It was frugal food dressed up as indulgence, and nobody at the table ever left hungry. Sawmill gravy over rice. Gravy was one of Mama's secret weapons for making a little stretch a long way. When there wasn't enough meat to go around, she'd cook flour in drippings until it browned, then whisk in milk until it became smooth and creamy. Poured over a heap of white rice, it turned a few cents' worth of food into a plateful of comfort. The gravy was peppery and rich, and the rice soaked up every drop. It might not have looked like much to outsiders, but in the South, Sawmill gravy over rice was a beloved supper that warmed the soul. Families ate it with gratitude, knowing it was both cheap and deeply satisfying. It was another reminder that thrift wasn't about going without. It was about finding comfort in what you had and making it feel indulgent. Chocolate depression cake. When money was scarce and rationing was in full swing, chocolate cake didn't disappear. It just adapted. Mama knew how to bake without eggs, butter, or milk, mixing flour, sugar, cocoa, vinegar, and a little oil into a batter that came out moist and rich. It was called depression cake or wacky cake, but the taste was anything but sad. Served plain with a dusting of sugar or topped with a thin glaze if ingredients allowed, it was indulgence in the middle of hardship. Children remembered birthdays and Sunday dinners by this cake, a symbol that sweetness could survive even in lean times. Chocolate depression. Cake wasn't just dessert. It was hope baked into every slice. Looking back, these meals weren't about recipes as much as they were about resilience. Southern mamas and grandmas knew how to turn scraps into suppers, bones into broth, and flour into biscuits that tasted like love. They taught us that indulgence isn't about luxury. It's about making the most of what you have and serving it with pride. For families who lived through hard times, these dishes were more than food. They were survival with a side of comfort. And for us today, they're a reminder that the kitchen holds more than just meals. It holds stories, memories, and proof that even in the leanest years, there was always something on the table worth savoring.